Mia, 26. Work at a nonprofit focused on women's rights and social advocacy. Officially part-time, but it never actually feels part-time. The work bleeds into everything: the reading, the group chats, the events. Pay is low, but I had convinced myself that was fine because the mission was bigger than money. Rent, car insurance, phone plan, all of that was covered by Dad. Had been that way since college, just sort of continued after. Dad is Ray, 54, works in construction engineering, been doing it his whole career. Not a talker, not someone who makes things into a big deal, just a guy who shows up, does what he said he'd do, and doesn't need anyone to notice. I had always found that quality slightly frustrating, like just once have a reaction, express something, be a person about it. But that was him. Never raised his voice, not at me, not at Mom. Paid for things without attaching conditions to them. We had been doing Sunday dinners every couple of weeks for as long as I can remember. Mom cooks, sets the whole table, the proper setup with placemats and everything. Dad and I would sit across from each other and talk about whatever. Lately, the tension had been building between us. I had been getting deeper into a lot of the theory around gender and power, reading a lot, going to talks and events, spending more time with people who were thinking about these things seriously. It was changing how I saw things, including how I saw him. I started noticing patterns in the way he talked to me, the way he'd bring up finances or future plans like he had the authority on those topics, the way he'd offer opinions about my choices without being asked. I started thinking of it differently than I used to, not as a dad being a dad, but as something else, something more structural, like the instinct to manage and advise was baked in so deep he didn't even see it. One of those Sundays, it came to a head. He started in on the usual thing, my financial situation, whether I had thought about savings, about what I was building toward. Nothing aggressive about it, just his standard concerned dad mode. But something about that particular night made me not want to just let it go. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had read something that week that was sitting close to the surface. Whatever it was, I cut him off. Told him clearly that his opinion doesn't matter anymore, that the world has changed and men like him just haven't caught up. It came out sharper than I maybe planned, but it felt true. Mom looked at her plate immediately. Dad stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at me for a moment, not angry, not hurt exactly, just looked. Then he nodded. Just a single nod, calm, no expression behind it. Then picked up his fork and kept eating. No argument, no wounded silence, no martyrdom. Nothing. I drove home that night feeling like I had finally said a real thing. Like I had put something into words that had been building for a long time. Texted Jade on the way back. She's the person I talk to most in our circle. Told her what happened. She said that was powerful, and that setting that kind of boundary with a parent is one of the hardest things. I agreed. Went to sleep thinking I had handled something correctly. The next few days were completely normal. No weird texts from him, no passive-aggressive check-ins from Mom. Nothing. Life just continued. I half expected some kind of response, but nothing came. Then I got a notification from my bank. Rent payment had been declined. My first reaction was that something was wrong on my end. Checked everything. Account looked fine. Then I counted back and realized the first had already passed. The transfer hadn't come through. Sat with that for a minute. Then texted him something casual, something like, "Hey, just checking if the transfer got delayed or something." He texted back within a few minutes. No anger in the message, no exclamation points, no obvious emotion at all. Just said that I had told him his opinion doesn't matter, and that his money is his opinion expressed in practical terms, and that he decided to take what I said seriously. Read it once, then again. Then a third time looking for the angle. Called him. He picked up on the first ring. That was somehow worse than if he'd let it go to voicemail. His voice was the same as always, completely even. No edge to it, nothing pointed. He repeated basically what the text said, that he heard me at dinner, that he respected what I communicated, and that this was him acting accordingly. I said that's not what I meant. He asked what I did mean. I didn't have a clean answer to that. Said something about the difference between financial support and having opinions. He said he understood and asked if I wanted to talk through it more. I said no and ended the call. Sat in my apartment staring at nothing for a bit. This is just him making a point, I thought. He'll let it sit for a few days and then it'll go back to normal. This is a reaction, not a decision. called Jade that evening, laid out the whole thing. She went quiet for a moment and then said that this is textbook financial control, that using economic leverage as a response to someone expressing their autonomy is a recognized pattern, that there is language for this kind of dynamic and it's not okay. I felt immediate relief when she said that. Yes, I thought, that's what this is. That's the framing. Posted in our group chat later. Everyone was pretty unified. Someone sent an article about how financial dependence is used to maintain control in family systems. Another person said her dad had done something similar years ago, and it took her a long time to see it clearly. The group was supportive in the way it always is, and I felt like I had the right read on the situation, but the rent was still not paid. Messaged my landlady and asked for a few extra days. She said that was fine this one time. I told myself he'd come around before the end of that window. A couple days later, I got a notice about the car insurance. Coverage had lapsed on the policy I was on through him. Then the phone plan. Had been on his family plan for years without thinking about it. Got a message that my line was being removed at the end of the billing cycle. The situation was expanding. I sat down and actually ran the numbers for the first time in probably longer than I should admit. My income against the actual cost of everything. Rent, utilities, food. Getting around without a car I could legally drive. Came out negative by several $100s every month. Just sat there looking at the number. It had this strange quality to it. Like I had known abstractly that the math was tight. But seeing the actual figure was different. Started thinking about how people do this. Like how the majority of people around my age do this every single month without any backup. And I had just always had that backup without thinking very hard about it. Asked Mom to reach out to him. She did. Called me back that evening sounding like she hadn't slept. Said he told her that I was an adult who gets to decide whose opinion matters to her. And that he respects that decision. And that he's not upset. She said, Mia, he says he's not upset. She said it the way you'd say it if the news was bad. And she was right to say it that way. Upset would have meant something. Upset would have meant I had gotten to him. That there was a reaction happening. That we were in a conflict with two sides. This was him being genuinely at peace. That was harder to work with than anything else he could have done. Jade offered her couch. I took it. Stayed a few nights. Her apartment is a one-bedroom, and she has a cat that is apparently sensitive to everything. By the fourth night, the cat was making sounds that concerned her, and she apologized and said it probably wasn't sustainable. I said I completely understood, and went back to my own place. Stood in my kitchen looking at the math I had written on a notepad. It was still the same. Spent time over the following days trying to work out what options I actually had. Looked into whether I qualified for any local assistance. The eligibility requirements were complicated, and I wasn't sure where I fell. Asked around at work about sublet situations or anything more affordable. Nothing came up right away. Thought about what I could actually cut from my spending. By that point, there wasn't much left that wasn't essential. The thing that kept creeping back was that he still wasn't doing anything. No guilt texts, no ultimatums, no checking in to see if I had figured out yet that he was right. Just nothing. Operating normally as far as I could tell. Jade's framing was still in my head. Financial control, leveraging resources, a coercive pattern. I held onto that framing because it gave the situation a structure I could work with. But there was something else underneath it that kept surfacing. The actual words I said at the dinner table. His opinion doesn't matter. I said that out loud, in his house, at the table where we had been eating together since I was a kid. I meant those words in the moment, or I thought I meant them. The thing I hadn't done was think past the moment. Think about what it means to tell someone their opinion doesn't count, and keep expecting them to behave as if it does. The landlady window was closing. I covered rent by moving some things around and picking up extra work hours. It was a lot. Not unsustainable exactly, but a different level of effort than I was used to. Started doing that math in my head constantly. The tracking and prioritizing that people do when there isn't much room for error. I had always had a buffer that made all of that invisible to me. The buffer was gone now, and the calculations were suddenly visible. It changed how days felt. The background noise of it. Checking the account, doing the arithmetic, thinking a few weeks ahead. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from that. Not physical exactly, just a low-level ongoing pressure. I noticed I was thinking less about the theory of things and more about the practical reality of things. When you're running close to the edge, the abstract stuff gets quieter. The concrete stuff gets louder. I wasn't sure how to feel about that shift. Jade and I talked a lot during this period. She was consistent in her framing, kept coming back to the manipulation angle, the power dynamic angle, the idea that what he was doing was a control mechanism dressed up as respect for my words. I understood the argument. I had made similar arguments myself about similar situations. But something about applying it to my actual father kept not quite fitting. Like the template was right, but the specific person wasn't matching it. Because a control mechanism implies the goal is to keep you under control. The guy I was dealing with wasn't trying to pull me back. He wasn't dangling anything, threatening to reinstate things if I behaved differently. He had just stopped, flat and clean, and gone about his life. I kept looking for the move underneath the move, and I couldn't find one, which either meant Jade was right and I just wasn't seeing it, or it meant something else. I decided to go talk to him in person. Didn't tell Jade I was going, not because I was hiding it, just didn't feel like explaining or processing it before it happened. Drove over on a Saturday, had the whole conversation planned out in my head on the way. Was going to explain the difference between financial support and personal opinions, that those are distinct categories and conflating them is a logical error. Was going to talk about how healthy relationships don't operate on transactional logic, that love or family connection shouldn't be contingent on agreement. I had all of it ready. He opened the door before I got to the porch, must have seen the car pull up, had a mug of coffee, was in his usual weekend clothes, the ones he's worn on Saturdays for as long as I can remember, said, "Come in," like it was any other day. We sat at the kitchen table, same chairs, same table, same window with the backyard behind it. I went through my prepared points, the distinction between finances and opinions, the coercive nature of withdrawing support as a response to a conversation, the transactional logic problem, the dependency and power imbalance it creates. He listened to all of it without saying anything. Didn't shift in his chair, didn't look away, didn't make a face, just listened. When I finished, he sat with it for a second. Then he asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. He said, "If I had kept sending money after you told me my opinion doesn't matter, what would that have looked like to you?" I didn't have an answer ready. He said he wasn't trying to make a point. Said that at the dinner table he heard a clear statement from me about how I see our relationship, and that he took it at face value because that seemed like the respectful thing to do. Said he wasn't going to decide I didn't mean what I said. He thought that would be more disrespectful than anything else. I sat there trying to find the part of that logic that didn't hold, and I couldn't immediately find it. The clock on the kitchen wall was ticking. I could hear it. Had never noticed that clock making sound before in my entire life. It's always just been there. We talked a bit more, but nothing got resolved in a clean way. I didn't apologize, he didn't ask me to. I didn't take back what I said at dinner, he didn't bring it up. At some point, I ran out of things to argue, and he offered more coffee. I said no and got up. He walked me to the door, said it was good to see me. Not sarcastic, not pointed, just said it like a fact. Drove home slower than usual. Sat in the parking lot outside my building for a while after I turned the engine off. Not in a dramatic way, just not ready to go inside. Thinking about what he said, the specific question he asked. If he had kept sending money after I said his opinion doesn't matter, what would that have looked like? It would have looked like him accepting a dynamic where he provides something, and I decide whether his thoughts about anything are worth hearing. I had never put it in those terms before, but that was the structure of what I was describing, and when I put it that way, it sat differently. Not because I thought he was right about everything, but because I started to see the shape of what I had actually said. Jade texted later, asking how it went. Wanted to know if he apologized or if he was still being difficult. I typed out a few different responses, deleted all of them. Finally just said, "No apology, but I think I understood something." She sent back a few question marks and asked what I meant. I put the phone face down on the table and didn't pick it up for a while. Lay on my back on the floor, which I do sometimes when I need to think. Went back over the conversation in my head. The question he asked, the way he had listened without interrupting. The clock. Had been reading and talking about power dynamics for a couple of years by that point. Thinking about who holds resources and who makes decisions and how those things interact. Thinking about the way certain patterns get normalized without anyone noticing. And here was my dad, who had not raised his voice, who had not threatened anything, who had not issued conditions, who had just listened to me, believed what I said, and acted on it. and it had knocked me sideways in a way that no argument had ever managed. Something about that was worth sitting with. I stayed on the floor for a while. The next stretch of time was about getting things more stable, took on more hours, cut things that weren't necessary, got the car insurance sorted through a basic plan I found, got a new phone plan that was manageable. It was tight, but it was mine. There was something clarifying about that, actually. Not that I'd want it to stay that way forever, but the experience of just dealing with the actual numbers without anyone else in the equation had a quality to it. Like I was seeing what things actually cost, what life actually costs. There's a difference between knowing that abstractly and knowing it because you're the one doing it. I started thinking more carefully about a lot of things I had been taking for granted, not just the financial stuff, but the whole architecture of assumptions I had been operating with. One of them was that because I disagreed with my dad on a lot of things, that meant his view on things wasn't worth much, that I had outgrown needing to hear what he thought, and that saying so was a mark of independence. The thing I was starting to reckon with is that independence and dismissal are not the same thing. I had confused them, or at least I had let one bleed into the other without noticing. Started thinking about something specific from around that time. I had been very focused on the idea of men and the ways they hold on to control. It was a lens I was applying constantly, and I kept trying to fit my dad into that lens. The controlling father, the man who uses money to manage his daughter, the patriarch who can't handle being challenged. But the more I looked at what he actually did, the less it fit. He didn't hold on, he let go. Immediately, cleanly, without drama. He heard what I said and acted on it. That's not what control looks like. Control is the opposite of that. Control is holding on, not letting go. I had a framework that I was applying to him, and it kept not matching. And at a certain point, you have to ask whether the framework is wrong or the person is wrong. I had been assuming it was the person, was starting to think it might be the framework. This is the part I found hard to talk to Jade about. Not because she's not a good friend. She is, genuinely. But I had been presenting the situation in a particular way from the beginning, and going back on that framing felt complicated. There's a thing that happens in groups where a situation gets named early and then stays named that way. Financial control, coercive dynamic, toxic pattern. Those words had been attached to this thing from the first conversation, and revisiting them would have required a different kind of conversation than I was ready to have. So I kind of went quiet about it in the chat, not consciously avoiding it, just stopped bringing it up. Jade noticed at some point and asked if I was still processing. I said yes, still processing, which was true. I was processing the fact that my father had done something I hadn't expected from him. He had taken me seriously, had assumed I meant what I said, and that had cracked something open that I was still looking at. Called him a few weeks after the kitchen table conversation. Not to ask for anything, just called. He picked up the same as always, on the first or second ring. I asked how things were going, actually asked and waited for the answer. He talked about a project he was working on, some kind of bridge repair or reinforcement thing. Technical stuff I don't really follow. But I asked a couple of follow-up questions, and he seemed genuinely pleased that I asked, not in an over-the-top way, just like slightly more engaged, talking with a bit more detail. At the end of the call, he said it was good to hear from me. I said, yeah, hung up and sat there. The thing I felt was hard to name exactly. Something like relief, but not relief because nothing was fixed. Something more like the feeling of having done a normal thing that had been not normal for a while, which I hadn't realized I was missing until I did it. Things didn't snap back to the way they were before. They were just different. There was less ease to it, at least for a while. More awareness of what we were doing when we talked. But he didn't treat me differently. Didn't bring up the dinner, didn't reference the money situation, just picked up where we left off each time. That was its own thing to notice. I had gone into that Saturday conversation prepared to defend myself, and he hadn't attacked. Had just answered the question I actually came with, which was whether there was a version of this that could continue. And the answer turned out to be yes. Obviously yes, that had never been in question for him. Started being more honest with myself about a few things during that period. One of them was that I had been operating with a kind of scorecard, where the things my dad got right didn't count for much, and the things I thought he got wrong were evidence of a whole system. And that wasn't really fair, or at minimum it wasn't accurate. He had paid for my life without demanding anything from me for years. Not praise, not compliance, not regular calls. He just did it because I was his kid, and that's what he thought that meant. And I had taken that completely for granted. so thoroughly that I had been able to make a speech about his opinions not mattering while sitting at his table, after he had kept me financially afloat for the better part of a decade. I don't want to turn this into a thing where I decided I was completely wrong about everything. That's not what happened. I still see things differently than he does. Still think about power and structure and the ways those things shape behavior. That didn't go away. What changed was more specific. I stopped treating the way I saw things as automatically more correct than the way he sees things. Like I had given myself permission to dismiss him before I even heard what he was saying, because he was a certain kind of man of a certain generation. And that was unfair. Not unfair in the way that word gets thrown around, just literally not accurate. I was judging him by a template instead of by him. The template was missing things. A different thing I started thinking about was the relationship between ideas and people. I had been getting very good at thinking in categories. Types of men, types of patterns, types of behavior. It's a useful way to see things in some contexts. But the problem is that categories don't have faces. They don't have kitchens and clocks and coffee mugs and the same jacket they've worn on Saturdays for 15 years. When you're dealing with an actual specific person, the categories get complicated. My dad didn't fit cleanly, and instead of letting that complicate my thinking, I had been trying to make him fit, which meant ignoring the parts that didn't work. That's not clear thinking. That's just a different kind of bias, just pointed in a direction I felt more comfortable with. Kept calling him after that. Not every week, not on a schedule, just when it seemed like a thing to do. He talked about work. I talked about work, sometimes about nothing in particular. He never raised the dinner. I think he considered it handled. Maybe it was handled differently for me than for him. For him, it was probably simple. She said a thing, I took it seriously, we're past it. For me, it was more like a slow unpacking of a bag I hadn't realized I was carrying. Still doing that, honestly. Some of it is about him specifically. Some of it is more general, about the gap between having a view of the world and actually living in it. Those two things are harder to keep aligned than they look from a distance. The financial stuff sorted out over time. Not immediately, but gradually. More income, better management, less panic. There was a point where I could actually look at the numbers without the low-level dread. That took a while to get to. When things were more stable, he offered to help again with a few things. Just mentioned it on a call, no ceremony, no, I told you so. Just said if it would help, he was there. I said I'd let him know. I appreciated that he made it an offer rather than a restoration. Like there was no debt to settle, no point scored, no lesson being administered, just his kid. And did she want some help? I said I'd think about it. I was still thinking about it when I'm writing this. There was a particular conversation with Jade that I keep coming back to. It was maybe 2 months after the Saturday kitchen table visit. We were getting coffee, just the two of us. She asked how things were going with my dad. And I said, honestly, fine, we've been talking more. And she got this look. Not hostile, more like concerned. She said she hoped I wasn't letting guilt pull me back into a dynamic that wasn't healthy. That sometimes when parents use money as leverage, the manipulation is subtle. And that patching things up doesn't automatically mean the underlying pattern is gone. I sat with that for a moment. I understood where she was coming from. I had said similar things to other people in other contexts, but something about hearing it applied to this specific situation felt off. I said something like, I don't think that's exactly what happened here. And she said, maybe, just be careful, which is what you say when you still think you're right, but you're willing to let it go for now. I let it go, changed the subject. But it stayed with me, not because she was wrong to say it, but because I realized we had arrived at a point where we were working with two different versions of the same story, and I had let her version stand for too long, because it was easier than going back. That's a thing that had happened without me fully noticing. The narrative had been set early, in those first texts and calls after the bank notification, when everything was raw and I needed a frame to put it in. The frame I reached for was the one I had: financial control, power dynamic, coercive behavior, and Jade had confirmed that frame. And the group had confirmed it, and it had become the settled version of events. The problem is that settled versions of events can calcify, and once they calcify, they're hard to revisit, because revisiting them means saying out loud that you got it wrong, which requires a specific kind of energy that's easy to avoid having. I had been avoiding having it for a while. The coffee conversation with Jade made me realize I needed to actually have it. Didn't do it dramatically. Just started being more honest in small ways about what I actually thought. When someone in the group chat referenced something similar happening to someone else, and compared it to my situation, I said something mild like, "Every situation is a bit different," which is vague enough that nobody argued with it, but it was at least true. Started doing that more. Small corrections instead of just going along with the framing. It's a quiet kind of work. Nobody outside your own head probably notices it, but it changes the texture of how you're thinking about something. Mom and I had a phone call during this period that surprised me a little. She usually stays in the middle of things, doesn't take sides. But on this particular call, she said something I didn't expect. She said, "Your dad has never once in his life tried to make you feel small. Not as a criticism, not as an argument, just said it and then moved on to something else." I didn't say anything back, just noted it, but it sat with me, because it was true. I went back through my whole memory of him, and I could not find a single instance of him trying to diminish me. He had opinions about my choices, sure. He thought some of my decisions were not the best ones, sure. But he had never made me feel stupid for them, or small for them, or wrong in a way designed to hurt. The worst I could say was that he was sometimes repetitive about certain concerns, and that I found it patronizing. But patronizing is different from malicious. I had been treating them as the same, and they're not. Something I noticed during the more financially tight weeks was how differently I related to time. Normally I'm pretty present-focused, thinking about current projects, current conversations, what's happening this week. When the money stuff was stressful, I became much more forward-focused in a mechanical way, always running projections. When does the next paycheck come? Does it cover this? What's the gap? It's not a fun way to live, but it gives you a different kind of clarity. You start seeing which things actually matter when things are constrained, and the things that actually matter turn out to be pretty boring. Rent, food, getting to work, staying healthy. The elaborate conversation about whose opinion matters or doesn't matter, about who has the right to say what, about the politics of family relationships and dependency and power. All of that went very quiet when I was trying to figure out whether I could cover utilities. Not because it's unimportant, but because the immediate practical world has a way of asserting itself. And I had been pretty insulated from that assertion for a long time, more insulated than I had acknowledged. I thought about that a lot. The insulation. I had been able to spend significant time and energy on abstract thinking, on theory, on frameworks, on the politics of everyday relationships. And that time and energy had been underwritten by the fact that my basic needs were covered, not by me, by him. While I was building arguments about whose opinion should count, he was the one making it possible for me to have the conversation at all. There's something uncomfortable in that. I sat with that discomfort for a while, instead of immediately trying to reframe it. It deserved to just sit there without being dressed up. Went back to the Sunday dinners after a while, not immediately. A couple of months passed first, but eventually Mom invited me, and it felt like the right time. It was different than before, quieter in some ways. I didn't bring up anything contentious, neither did he. We just ate and talked about ordinary things. At one point, he made a comment about something going on at work, asked what I thought about a particular situation, and I told him what I thought. And he listened and said that was actually a useful angle he hadn't considered, nothing big, but I noticed it. He had asked for my opinion, and meant it. That felt like something. I'm not sure exactly what. Maybe just evidence that things could be different going forward than they had been. Not fixed or resolved in some complete way, but different, more honest maybe. Less me performing an argument and more me actually talking to the person sitting across the table. Jade and I are still close. She's a good person, and I value her a lot, but I think we've shifted slightly in how we talk about certain things. I bring less to her that's about my family, not because I'm hiding anything, just because I trust my own read on it more than I used to, which is maybe what was missing the whole time. Not that I shouldn't have talked to people about it, but that I outsourced the interpretation of it too quickly, before I had sat with it long enough to know what I actually thought. I had needed a frame and grabbed the first one that fit, and then defended that frame instead of staying open to what was actually happening. That's a pattern worth knowing about yourself. The thing I keep coming back to, the one image that kind of captures all of it, is that nod at the dinner table. When I told him his opinion didn't matter, he didn't argue, didn't look hurt, didn't go cold. He just nodded. Like, okay, I heard that. Noted. And then he ate his dinner. I had read that as passivity at the time, or as the kind of quiet that is just suppressed frustration. I was wrong about that. It was just him being exactly who he is, A person who listens to what you say and believes you mean it, who doesn't assume you're speaking in temporary frustration, who treats your words as real, and who then acts on them. That's not a common thing to do. Most people would have argued or dismissed it, or waited for me to walk it back. He did none of those things. He just believed me. And in doing so, he made me responsible for what I had said in a way that nothing else could have. I'm writing this because it happened, and I wanted to put it somewhere outside my own head, not to make a point about anything, or to tell other people what to think about their own situations. Just because it was a real thing that happened, and it changed something in how I operate. I went into that dinner table moment thinking I was claiming independence. What I found out was that I was claiming something I didn't fully understand yet. Independence isn't just the freedom to say what you think. It's also the responsibility for what you say. When he took me at my word, I found out pretty fast whether I meant it the way I said it. And the answer was more complicated than yes or no, which is maybe the most honest answer to most things. The whole thing didn't teach me one clean lesson. There wasn't a moment where everything clicked, and I understood something I hadn't before. It was more of a slow accumulation of sitting with the discomfort of having said something in public that you didn't fully mean, or that you meant differently than you thought, of watching someone respond to you with more grace than you showed them, of running the math for the first time and realizing how much had been invisible, of noticing that anger at a category and anger at a person are different things, and that mixing them up doesn't usually lead anywhere useful, of calling someone not because you need something, but because they're your dad and you've eaten Sunday dinners across from each other your whole life. I'm still figuring out how I feel about a lot of this. There are things I said at that dinner table that I would still say, and things I said that I wouldn't. The distinction between those two things is clearer to me now than it was then. That's probably all you can ask for from a situation like this. That you come out the other side knowing a little more about what you actually think versus what you thought you thought. One more thing I'll say. There was a moment, maybe a month after the kitchen table visit. I was at work, in the middle of a pretty ordinary afternoon. A colleague said something offhand about her dad helping her move apartments that weekend. Said it the same way you'd say the weather was fine. No weight to it, just a fact. And I felt something weird for a second. Not jealousy exactly, more like a recognition. That I had been so deep in the language of power and control and dependency, that I had lost sight of what the thing actually was on a basic level. A person who shows up and helps you move apartments. A person who transfers money on the first of the month without making you ask. A person who nods and says, "Come in," and means it. Those things have a name, and it's not control. It's just care. And I had been running it through such a specific filter that I had stopped seeing it as what it was. I think about the version of me that sat at that dinner table and said his opinion doesn't matter. I understand why she said it. She had been building a view of the world, and she was testing it out loud. And in that particular moment, it felt like the right test. But tests have consequences, especially when the person you're testing on is the kind of person who believes you. I don't regret the whole thing. That would be too simple. I learned something about myself that I don't think I would have learned any other way. About the gap between holding a position and living inside it. About what it actually means to not need someone's opinion versus what it sounds like from the outside when you say it at a dinner table. Those are different things. I know that now in a way I didn't before. Anyway, that's the whole thing. Make of it what you want.